production that produces documentaries, dramas, info ads, and interactive videos. A leading Singapore production company. It opens its door in 1996 and boasts a multicultural team that brings a cosmopolitan richness in approach to work. So, Sen Gloria Durano Borja Estrada is one of the contributors in the documentary film. She is one of the Zamboanga City's premier artists, a true Filipino painter and sculptor with a style that is varied as her other talents. So she's currently working as an executive assistant in the office of the city mayor and is overlooking the city hall restoration. Next one. So this is her school that she attended. So organization or companies affiliated with documentary film, the National Commission on Museums, NCCA, Mindanao Association of Museums, Secretary Art Historian. So ito yung mga nag-contribute dun sa film produced by OK Films, Dr. Samuel Tan, Margarita Oampo, and other international Asian historian. Mamaya makikita nyo sila dun sa papanood namin sa inyong film. So, historical background of the document. So, the raiders of the Sulu Sea were well known in our history as brutal, savage, fearless slave raiders, or what other people call them, pirates. So, hailing from the southern region of the Philippines, they were the three groups of Muslims. These were the three groups of Muslims that reigned during the 17th century. The Balangini tribe, or also known as Isamal, the Ilanun, and the Tausug tribes. They raided and plundered settlements in the Philippines, Borneo, Java, and the Straits of Malacca, and all over Southeast Asia in the search of human cargo to feed the growing demands of the slave trade in the 16th to 19th century. The raiders are well known to build deadly weapons, build extraordinary warships that could fight off bigger and heavier Western ships, and also well organized during attacks.
So, these men have been a terror to the sea. So, since they are raiders, everyone is afraid of them. So, are they really the savages they were made out to be? So, we will know later in the documentary film that we will show you. So, some historians have argued that these were indigenous people really defending their way of life. So, why were they defending? So, the Spaniards have taken colonization of the Philippines way back. So, when the Spaniards reached Mindanao, they were being Christianized. So, the Muslims don't want this. So, they feel like they're being oppressed. They feel like the Christianity is being forced on them. So, they fight. So, this is a story of men who clung firstly on their faith, illuminated technologically superior foe. A story of how these men who lived by the sword eventually died by it. So Spaniards had guns, had cannons, while Muslims only had swords to fight. So Raiders of the Sulu Sea. So this is a documentary film directed by H1 Ockman. So we will show you the film.
It is the 18th century, and life for some of the trustful inhabitants of the Philippines was anything but idyllic. For without warning, they could be attacked by the merciless Ilanun, the raiders of the Sulu Sea.
the Unang captured people, they would bore a hole through their palm, put a string through the palm of each person.
These raiders were fearsome and fearless in battle, even against better armed, technologically superior colonial forces. To the Western colonists, the raiders were nothing more than barbaric outlaws or pirates, and they were hunted down as such.
It's very hard for someone who's not used to seeing slave raiding to understand slave raiding during those times was legal.
There is speculation that these raiders were not the savages they were made out to be, but merely indigenous people defending their way of life against a foreign oppressor. But there is little doubt that these raiders were skilled fighters and deadly swordsmen. They were also expert sailors and builders of formidable vessels of war. But these were no ragtag band of marauders. They were a well-organized force that could attack with precision and strategy. And they gave the Western colonial forces a run for their money. It is December the 8th, 1720. In the southernmost reaches of Spanish-occupied Philippines stands Zamboanga City. Protecting the city is Fort Pilar. The garrison of 600 Spanish soldiers have already fought off several local rebel attempts to take the fort.
Regresa! Regresa!
But on this day, they will face a threat of unprecedented proportions. Heading their way, hundreds of ships carrying 3,000 battle-hardened raiders. The Spaniards are grossly outnumbered. The battle for Fort Pilar is about to begin. Zamboanga City sits at the tip of the southernmost peninsula of the Philippines. It is by no means a bustling metropolis these days, but it is still strategically located along an important sea route between the northern and southern regions of the Philippines. It was Zamboanga's geographical advantage that made it valuable to the Catholic Spaniards who colonized it in the 16th century. To protect their interests, the Spanish colonists built forts to discourage potential invaders. At the front line of these defenses was Fort del Pilar, a 10-meter high fortress that sprawled over 2 acres.
One of the most celebrated attacks at Fort Pilar was the 1720 attack of the Maguindanao king, Dalasi. He was the king of Bulig in Maguindanao. Raja Dalasi was planning the attack on Zamboanga City together with the joint forces of the Sulu Sultanate.
The Sulu and Maguindanao Sultanates were then the 2 main kingdoms controlling the Muslim colonies of the southern Philippines. With the king of Maguindanao, Raja Dalasi, at the helm, they launched a bloody attack on Fort Pilar.
The attack Zamboanga burned the town around the fort, cut down provisions, the line of provisions for the Spaniards, and began war against the soldiers of beside the fort.
But taking the fort would not be easy for Raja Dalasi and his fighters. This was a structure designed to withstand even the destructive force of cannonballs. Every possible approach to the fort was defended by rows of Spanish artillery. But even with their superior defenses and weaponry, the Spanish soldiers are greatly outnumbered, 1 to 5. Raja Dalasi's militia, armed with only an assortment of swords, plunged aggressively into battle against the cannons and firearms of the Spaniards. Raja Dalasi's men are decimated by cannon fire, but they are relentless. Wave after wave of raiders attacked the fort, until they finally reached the outer walls. The Spanish soldiers resort to desperate measures to fend off the raiders. They throw rocks and boiling water at Dalasi's men as they scale the walls of the fort. Raja Dalasi's raiders fight with a vengeance. The desire to rid Zamboanga of the Spanish drives them forward.
They really have to suppress the Spanish presence here in the peninsula because the fort was the base operations point to check on slave raiding going to the north and coming back.
According to some historians, slavery had been practiced among some tribes in the Philippines before the arrival of Western powers. But it was never a widespread or frequent activity. But the arrival of the Spanish and their desire to dominate trade in the region would trigger an escalation of slave raiding. The people of the Southern Sultanates would defy their self-proclaimed Spanish masters by targeting Christian communities in the north. The Spanish referred to the slave raiders as Moros, after the Muslim fighters they encountered on Spanish soil some 75 years earlier. But they were, in fact, from 3 different tribes, and they would challenge Spanish authority throughout its occupancy.
Piracies that were described by the colonial powers or colonial rule actually involve activities of different tribes in the Mindanao area as well as the Sulu archipelago. But there were actually 3 particular groups of Muslims that were identified in these colonial sources. One was the Balagigi tribes or Sama that occupied the chain of islands between Basilan and Sulu Island. The second one, which is very important in piracy history, were the Ilanons.
The Ilanun and Samal were both long-standing seafaring communities. They would often join forces with the Tausug, a tribe without the maritime experience, but known for its fierce warriors and widespread political power. It was in fact the Tausug that controlled the Sulu Sultanate in the south, with a lineage of Tausug sultans and high-ranking officials dating as far back as the 15th century.
Among the piratical attacks or retaliatory attacks conducted from Sulu on Mindanao, always carried these contingents. No? The Iranon, the Balangi Isama, and of course the Thousand One.
But historians also question whether the raiders from the southern Philippines should be called pirates. It comes down to intent. Were these raiders out for personal gain, or were they simply serving their local political masters?
All books that talk about piracy deal with the problem of terminology. That using the English word pirate is actually misleading in some respects because it doesn't cover raiders, it doesn't cover people who act on behalf of the state.
For these Philippine Moros, the raids to the north and attacks on Spanish forces were acts of retaliation against the foreign occupier. Most of these raids were also sanctioned by the sultanates in the name of an even higher cause, Islam. The Philippines is made up of three main regions: Mindanao in the south, Visayas in central Philippines, and Luzon in the north. Islam reached the shores of the southern Philippines in 1380 and began to spread north. But it would later come up against an obstacle in the shape of the cross.
There was certainly a great deal of pressure from the south for populations in the Visayas to become Islamicized. But the presence of the Spanish in the Visayas and in the southern Luzon to a great degree disrupted that spread of Islam. In fact, the Spanish colonial administrators thought it was their responsibility to prevent the spread of Islam from the south to the Christianized populations to the north.
At its peak, the Spanish had an impressive empire that stretched across much of the world. These conquests were motivated not only for the wealth of these colonies, but the opportunity to propagate Christianity. In the Philippines, they landed in Luzon in the north. From here, Christianity spread, displacing Islam and indigenous tribal beliefs. In the predominantly Muslim South, however, Christianity's growing influence was viewed with scorn.
Where the Spanish is concerned, it wasn't always about what the people in the South were after. It was more that the presence of the Spanish really undermined their commercial interests in the region. Now you had a new power in the region which was exerting its own agendas and its own influences. What the sultanates in the South wanted to do was to maintain their power, right, if not increase it a little bit more.
In the power struggle that ensued, both sides used their religious ideologies to further their influence. For the Muslim sultanates, eradicating the Christian Spanish presence in Zamboanga was one of their top priorities. But how could the sword-wielding tribes of the South stand up against a militarily superior foe? How could they have assembled a flotilla of battleships that could pose a serious threat to the Spanish colonialists? The answer lies buried deep under centuries of soil. Butuan is a small town located at the northernmost region of Mindanao. In 1977, an archaeological dig would unearth the secrets of a distant past. Evidence of an ancient maritime civilization was found in this pond. Carbon dating of artifacts found point to a seafaring civilization that existed in the 4th century. ancient mariners who traversed the seas around the Philippines long before the arrival of Western colonists. The dig would eventually unearth a small fleet of ancient seaworthy vessels. The people who built these ships were adept sailors with an intimate knowledge of the seas and how to navigate them. The slave raiders inherited these maritime skills from these early southern Filipino seafarers. It helped them build a flourishing trade in the bounty of the sea. By the mid-1700s, these ships evolved into sturdier, more seaworthy craft, and the scope of their commercial ventures grew. And fueled by a growing demand for slaves in the south, so too did the intensity and frequency of their raiding expeditions. What began as small raids within the archipelago went beyond Philippine seas to the Straits of Malacca, close to 2,000 kilometers away.
Increasing the demand for slaves fell into a situation by the mid-18th century when something very unusual, unprecedented happened in the Malacca Straits region. And that was the arrival, and seasonal arrival, of very large numbers of raiders from the southern Philippines.
The unang slave raiders who landed at the Straits of Malacca were skilled warriors, and they sailed formidable ships.
They could go very shallow waters. They had compasses even. They had cannon on board their ships. They had many rowers.
The unang built long-range vessels like the Joanga or Lano. These ships had a large wide keel for stability and 3 large cloth sails on sturdy, collapsible tripod-like masts. These vessels were 24 to 27 meters long, with 6-meter wide hulls. Each had cannons mounted at the bow. Complementing the 3 mainsails were 34 oars on each side, rowed by captured slaves. These were their flagships, the unang equivalent of a modern cruiser. Each vessel carried between 100 and 150 men, a captain or nakoda, a steersman and warrior sailors, slaves to power the oars, and captured local guides to help navigate unknown waters. The unang used compasses, brass telescopes, and the stars to navigate. They were also knowledgeable about the tempestuous monsoon winds of the region, and used them to travel extensively during the months between August and October, in a period called the pirate season. By 1830, a smaller, faster, and more maneuverable form of raiding boats replaced the Joangas. They were the fast attack boats of the Samal raiding tribes, and they were called the Garay. The Garay class of vessels was built from bamboo
bases, and
They weren't enough of them.
to row into the shorelines and pretend that they are fishermen. They're harmless people.
But these slave raiders were anything but harmless.
When the Nano captured people, they would bore a hole through their palm, put a string through the palm of each person. Europeans were unable to do anything about it at this stage. They didn't have, their ships were not as fast as those that they ran on. They were just maneuverable, and if they were becalmed, then of course they were fair game. and there weren't enough of them.
Unlike the ships of the raiding tribes, Spanish galleons were slow but very flourishing.
Trade.
So, ano yung napansin niyo sa first half ng documentary? So, nakita niyo naman yung economy ng raiders noon, slave trading. So, nagka-capture sila ng slaves, kumuha sila sa iba't ibang shorelines, nagpapanggap sila ng mababay, tapos bigla nilang lulusubin, tapos pagkukuhain nila yung mga tao, tapos binibenta, slaves. So, bakit nagka-interest yung Spain sa Zamboanga? Dahil ito sa geographical advantage niya, tapos dahil sa trading potential niya. So, kaya nagtayo dito yung Spaniards ng forts. At isa na dito yung Pilar Fort. Yung Pilar Fort na inatake noong 1720. So, Fort Pilar is the Spain's last stronghold and bastion of defense and economic expansion in the south of the Philippines. So, it represents the Southeast Asian flourishing freight trading in the area. So, gusto makita ng Spain yung trading na to. Hindi lang nila gusto maging part nito, gusto nila kontrolin ito. So, ayun nga, yung dumating nga yung 1720, di ba, nandun yung Spaniards sa Pilar Fort. So, nag-umatake yung Sulu, pati doon ako sa place, sa Fort Pilar. So, yung mga raiders na ito, tinawag din silang Filipino Muslim who attacked the Fort Pilar in Zamboanga in 1720. So, sa laban na to, nangyari dito, 600 Spaniards versus 3,000 Filipino. Sino nanalo? Siyempre yung Spaniards kasi meron silang technology, meron silang mga baril, meron silang kanyon. Samantalang mga Filipino, meron lang silang mga espada bilang sadlatan nila.
Ito naman yung i-review o ilanon. Ito yung Islam or Muslim. More of ethnic groups native to Mindanao, Philippines, and west coast of Sabah. Malaysia is where colonists. Sumatra to the Sulu archipelago and the east of Borneo. They were known for being expert sailors and with their courage and skills. They were the masters of the Sulu Sea. Raiders was considered brutal savages. They built impressive ships that was to believed to be faster than the Spaniards, galleons, and deadly weapons called paano that enabled them to cut off Spaniards' weapons. Ilanon, Balangini Samad, and Sultanate of Sulu, all which employing Tausug tribes, raided and plundered settlements in the Philippines. Borneo, Java, the Strait of Malacca, and all over the Southeast Asia. He searched for human cargo to fill the growing demands of the slave trade in the 16th and 19th century. They were sanctioned by their respective sultanates or their tribal leaders, instigating a wave of terror throughout the archipelago by 300 years. Then, yung leaders nila, sinususunod niya yung mga miyembro niya na gumawa ng mali kahit ayaw naman ng mga kasama niya. So, ito yung ordinary season na mapa yung pinuntahan ng mga Spaniards. Ito yung Ilanos, Balangini Driver Samad, 4,000 nakikita niyo sa video. Ito naman yung mapa ng pirate season. Ito na yung gumamit, pansin nyo, marami silang napuntahan dahil gumamit sila ng tempesta, monsoon, wind, o ito yung tawag na parang sa nila na compass. The raiders would travel and employ people from nearby tribes and then from a big fleet for raiding.
So for the next slide, slave trading was a business that they were not really ships and axes. So So, basically, dito, ginagamit nila yung slave trading kasi as business. Kasi, mga nakaraang panahon talagang yung slave trading is more of business. Hindi lang yung mono ang gumagawa. Actually, alam ko naman may na-watch kayo ng movies na yung slave trading is talamak sa Egypt or Persia and other international countries. So what they did was go and land in different shores, posing as fishermen without any warning, under 1 meter long swords, and take as many slaves as they can. So sabi nga nung example ko, nagpapanggap sila as ordinary people. Dito more on fishermen kasi nga raiders sila, sea raiders ulit. Later, i-discuss ko yung mga swords na ginamit. And then once captured, the slaves are punctured and tied to each other. The slaves are loaded in their 25 to 27 meters by 6 meter ropes that has 34 horsemen and sails. So later, i-discuss ko yung pagkano ginagawa nila. Pero yung sa slavery, as you watch on the videos, medyo marahas yung ginagawa talaga. Talaga yung parang ginagawa as preso, then pinapacture yung pamilya. So ito yung ginagamit na ships. More or less, the ships used by the raiders were known as proa or garage, and they varied in the size. The majority were wooden sailing galleys, about 90 feet long with a beam of 10 feet by 27.4 by 6.1 meters. They carried around 50 to 100 meters. So pinapatakbo siya like Dragon Ball. More or less, hindi ko alam kung narinig ko sa video. Mas mabilis yung proa organized 3 times sa gagawin. Yung normal speed ng proa organized 16 knots, which is equivalent to 29.6 km per hour. So, ibig sabihin, yung values is more or less 10 kilometers per hour. So, these are the weapons that were used by the Moro. So, barong 3 Captain. The difference or is barong are rounded shape, Captain is angular shape, and then Chris has like corrugated edges. So international trade was already booming way before the Westerners or Spanish trade. They were not only attracted for the products in the trade, but also had an intention of the flow over the trade. By doing so, they began conversion and colonization of the islands. This resulted to some conflicts between the Muslims or the raiders who were at the time spreading Islam and the newly arrived Spanish. So dito, like yung sinabi ko kanina, more or less yung pagiging raiders is culture na rin talaga sa ibang bansa. Not only us are doing this, but also different countries and different empires and countries. And pinapakita lang dito, later na-discuss ko rin na more or less, kasi kung tutuusin, Muslims are the first pa rin, kasi wala namang Muslim dito sa Pilipinas before time. But sila actually yung pinakaunang nag-colonize sa atin. Kaya nagkaroon ng Muslim dito sa atin. So basically, nagkaroon ng problema sa religious beliefs kasi Spaniards are patronizing Christianity. So hindi lang talaga siya more religious but more religious beliefs. So it was said that conflict did not stem from the business or trade, but was more of belief or religious belief. There is a speculation that these raiders were not the savages. They were made out to be, but merely indigenous people defending their way of life against the foreign oppressor. So, sabi ko nga dito, hindi lang more on trade, more on principle na din siya. Kasi nga, Muslim sila and then the Spaniards are patronizing Christianity. So, basically, magkakaroon talaga ng pag-alitan. Like in this case as well. So, yung sa second paragraph naman, syempre, kino-colonize tayo ng Spaniards. So, ang tendency ng kung sino nakatira doon is to defend themselves. kasi ayaw na rin na politics ng
December 8, 1720, Rahab the Red at 3,000 strong warriors and 600 Spaniards. So this was before Iraq. Kahit malakas yung mga armas ng Spaniards, talo pa rin yung mga Spanish tapos yung baril nila, yung musket, puputok ng tatlo ng bawat minuto. Kahit may armor yung mga raiders, hindi tumatalab yung sa baril ng baril. Tapos next, the slavery trade of the traders ended when the Spaniards ordered three steamboats from Ilan. Probably si Governor General Cabrera ang nag-order ng steamboat. Tapos the steamboats were faster easier to navigate and had various permanent take. Yun, doon sila kumawi na talubin yung raiders. Other tribes and guild of movement and movement guild their they rather be killed than be captured. So prefer nilang pakamatay sa American colonization. As the new colonial master, the Americans came into the country. Their main leaders found they suffered with and because they were raised by the Americans. So wala na yung mga
So we realized that even for the months of our forefathers, we were known for being expert sailors. So pagka ayon nga sa report, makita nyo na talagang matatapag sila, alam nila, malawak yung kalaban nila sa dagat, lalong-lalo na sa hangin. Pati yung stars o constellation ginagamit nila sa pag-navigate. So they built impressive ships. So pag napansin nyo na hindi sila nahabol ng Spaniards until na bumili yung Spaniards ng steamships galing sa England. So meron din mga armas yung mga ships nila, yung ships ng mga raiders. May mga kanyang sa harapan. So our forefathers were known to be fearless in battles. Fearless in battles, kaya nga nila lumaban sa mas nakakangat na technology sa kanila. So the tribes were able to organize a flotilla of 100 ships or more with more than 3,000 men. This happened with the three tribes who need to raid the Fort Pilar. So sa Fort Pilar nga, di ba nandito yung 600 versus 3,000. So yung 3,000 men na to, hindi lang siya galing sa isang tribe. So yung mga nearby tribes, yung mga Ilanons nga, pati Tauso, sama-sama sila para labanan yung Spaniards na nagre-reside sa Fort Pilar. So sige nyo, sa report na to, anong pwede natin matutunan? Pwede natin matutunan yung solidarity. So, sa panahon natin ngayon, parang mahirap mag-unite, di ba? Parang matak-matak tayo. So, unlike sa katulad nga nung nakaraan, mag-isa lang nag-unite. So, doon nag-unite sila, natalo pa rin sila, pero nandun pa rin yung kakayahan nila na nandun pa rin yung power ng teamwork. Isipin nyo kung isa nag-unite, sila sumabak, edi mas madali silang natalo. So, ayun, therefore lang after nga, tapos yung stronghold sa faith natin. So, di ba nga, dumating yung Spaniards, nagpapalaganap sila ng Christianity. So, parang na-oppress sila, parang ayaw nila dito eh. Pinwersa pa sa kanila, iba na yun, ayaw na nila yun, kaya maglaban sila. War na yun.
Sino po si Dizon? Sasagot ko yung tanong mo.
So yung what is the objective of the three tribes in attacking Fort Pilar? So yung objectives nga nila dito kasi di ba Muslim sila, ano religion nila? Islam. So nandito yung Spaniard sa Fort Pilar. So nagpapalaganap siya ng Christianity, ayaw nila. Pinapalayas ng three tribes na to yung Spaniards para mapigilan yung paglaganap. So kaya sila nagtipon-tipon, mga Muslims, tapos inatakan nila yung Fort Pilar. Ay, tsaka isa pa yung objective nila doon para mabawi yung sa trading nila. Kasi yung fourth pillar, nandito yung, parang ito yung ano eh, yung gitna, ito yung may magandang ruta dito para sa trading sa dagat. Trading nila. Okay, number 1, sa out of the 3 tribes na nabanggit na raiders of the Sulu Sea, magbigay lang kayo ng isa. Magsulat kayo kung ano yung gusto niyo tanong sa amin. Isa lang.